Imagine exchanging a human being for 40 liters of wine. It seems absurd, doesn't it? But there was a time when this transaction occurred regularly, and merchants profited. We're talking about ancient Rome, where wine wasn't just a drink, it was power, status, and literally currency. A time when the thirst for this drink fueled empires and created one of the first supply crises in history. How did a simple fermented grape become more valuable than gold? How did Rome transform pleasure into an economic weapon? And why did Gaul nobles trade slaves for amphorae of wine? This is the story of when alcohol was worth more than human life. To understand how we reached this absurd point, we need to go back to the streets of Rome in the 2nd century BC. There, amid the uneven cobblestones and the din of commerce, we found something that today would seem impossible: wine consumed by absolutely everyone. From the sweating slave who carried stones to build the Colosseum, to the senator who decided the direction of the empire, everyone drank wine daily. We're not talking about a society of alcoholics. Roman wine was diluted with water, a practice that transformed the beverage into something closer to what we would today call an energy drink. It was safe, nutritious, and, above all, democratic. While other civilizations created social barriers through food, Rome dissolved them with wine. In the taverns of Pompeii, colorful murals depicted Mercury and Bacchus side by side, the god of commerce next to the god of wine. This image was no coincidence. It was the visual representation of an economic truth. In Rome, wine and money were practically synonymous. The Romans had a saying that perfectly summed up this obsession: Nihil tem populare quam vinum. Nothing was as beloved by the people as wine. But this collective passion created something unexpected. Wine became a parallel social currency. Contracts were sealed with toasts. Political alliances were forged at wine-soaked banquets. Debts were paid with amphorae instead of gold coins. Rome had unwittingly created an economy based on alcohol. This is where our history takes a dark turn. After defeating Carthage in the Punic Wars in 146 BC, Rome wasn't content simply to conquer territory, it stole knowledge. Among the spoils of war was an unexpected treasure: the agricultural treatises of Mago, a Carthaginian who had documented the secrets of winemaking. Rome absorbed this knowledge like a thirsty sponge. Soon, Italian vineyards began producing superior wines, using techniques that had taken centuries to develop. But here's the crucial detail: Rome decided this knowledge was its exclusive property. Around the 2nd century BC, a terrible law was enacted. Provinces outside the Italian peninsula were banned from producing wine. Completely banned. Imagine the impact. Entire regions that had grown grapes for generations were forced to uproot their vines. The official justification was to protect the quality of Roman wine, but the reality was much more sinister. Rome had created the first cartel in history. By controlling production, they could manipulate prices as they saw fit. And that's exactly what they did. In the distant provinces, especially in Gaul, Roman wine prices reached levels that defied all economic logic. A single amphora, about 40 liters of wine, cost the equivalent of a human slave. 40 liters of fermented liquid was worth the same as a human life. To get a sense of the absurdity of this proportion, imagine if today a bottle of wine cost the same as a luxury car. It would be unthinkable, wouldn't it? But in Roman-dominated Gaul, this was the everyday reality. The Gallic nobles, accustomed to their barbarian beer, quickly developed an obsession with imported wine. It wasn't just the taste, it was status. Drinking Roman wine meant belonging to the civilized world. It was the difference between being considered a barbarian and being seen as someone of refined culture. This dynamic created a terrible, vicious cycle. The more the Gauls desired wine, the more the Romans raised prices. The higher prices rose, the more wine became a symbol of prestige. And the more prestige was associated with wine, the more people were willing to pay any price for it. Roman merchants crossed the Alps, carrying amphorae as if they were bars of gold. On the other side, they found desperate buyers willing to trade everything: land, livestock, and yes, slaves for a few vessels of the golden liquid. Behind this economic madness were the true beneficiaries, the Roman landed senators. These men were no different from modern speculators. They perfectly understood the mechanisms of supply and demand and manipulated them with diabolical mastery. Controlling the vineyards in Italy and having secured a monopoly through law, These aristocrats acted like a kind of OPEC of antiquity. When they wanted to increase profits, they simply reduced production. When they needed more foreign currency, they increased the supply slightly to keep buyers interested. The perverse thing is that many of these speculators were the same senators who voted on the laws that maintained the monopoly. It was a system created by them, for them, at the expense of entire peoples who had been deprived of the basic right to produce their own wine. These stratospheric profits not only enriched individuals, they financed the expansion of the Roman Empire itself. Each amphora sold at absurd prices generated taxes that paid soldiers, built roads, and erected aqueducts. Wine had become a source of imperial financing. But the impact went far beyond economics. Rome was literally altering the culture of entire peoples through its control of wine. Celtic tribes, who for centuries had based their rituals and celebrations on beer, began to abandon their traditions. Roman wine didn't just reach tables, it reached temples, weddings, and funerals. Rome was, drop by drop, replacing the cultural identity of the conquered peoples with its own. It was a form of domination far more subtle and effective than military force. Young Gauls grew up watching their parents go into debt to buy Roman wine. They learned from an early age that their native culture was inferior, barbaric, and outdated. Wine became the tangible symbol of Roman superiority, and this created generations that internalized their own cultural inferiority. The situation became even more sinister when we realized that the slave trade increased dramatically in regions where Roman wine was more expensive. This was no coincidence. Entire families were sold to finance the aristocratic addiction to imported wine. Tribal chiefs, who lacked enough coin to pay for wine, began selling members of their own communities. Prisoners of war, who could previously be freed or integrated into the tribe, became commodities to be traded for amphorae. Rome had created, inadvertently or not, a system that turned human beings into a means of payment for alcohol. Roman wine was literally costing human lives, and everyone involved knew it perfectly well. Like any scheme based on artificial scarcity, the Roman wine monopoly carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. As the empire expanded, it became increasingly difficult to control production in distant territories. New provinces meant new administrative costs. Maintaining soldiers to guard vineyards and ensure that no one planted grapes illegally was costly. At the same time, the demand for wine in the new conquests grew exponentially. Roman merchants themselves began to realize that they could profit more by allowing controlled local production than by maintaining an absolute monopoly. After all, transporting amphorae thousands of kilometers was expensive and dangerous. Slowly, the system began to show signs of fatigue. Local revolts, motivated, among other things, by the prohibition of viniculture, became more frequent. The cost of maintaining the monopoly was approaching dangerously close to the profits it generated. Change, when it came, was gradual but definitive. Around the 1st century BC, Rome began allowing limited wine production in the provinces, always under strict control and heavy taxation. Ironically, this loosening of the monopoly coincided with the height of Roman power. The empire had learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes, partially controlling a huge market is more profitable than completely monopolizing a small one. But the cultural and social scars remained. Entire generations had grown up associating wine with power, status, and civilization. Entire peoples had lost their ancestral traditions in exchange for a fermented beverage. The slave trade continued, but now fueled by other commodities and other vices. The model had been established. Control the supply of something people desperately desire, and you can make them trade anything for it. 2,000 years later, this story sounds eerily familiar. Replace wine with oil, semiconductor chips, or rare earths, and you have a perfect picture of how many modern markets work. The Roman strategy was simple and brutal. Identify something everyone wanted, monopolize its production, and then charge whatever price they wanted. What made it all the more perverse was that wine was no longer an expendable luxury. It had become an integral part of everyday life. Rome taught the world a terrible lesson about the power of monopolies. It showed how basic necessities can be transformed into economic weapons. It demonstrated that when you control something people need, they are willing to pay any price, literally any price. Today, when we see corporations controlling internet access, governments manipulating food prices, or cartels controlling natural resources, we are seeing direct echoes of the Roman wine strategy. Remember the question we asked at the beginning? How could anyone trade a human being for 40 liters of wine? Now you know the answer. It wasn't madness, it wasn't an exception, it was the logical and predictable result of a carefully designed economic system. Rome artificially created a scarcity of something people desperately desired. Then it exploited that scarcity to extract wealth from entire nations. Wine became more valuable than money because Rome decided it would be so. The real tragedy wasn't the absurd price of wine, it was the realization that human beings have always been treated as commodities when it suited the powerful. Wine only made this more obvious, more tangible, more shocking. Today, when we buy products made with modern slave labor, when we pay inflated prices for essential medicines, or when we accept abusive conditions to access basic services, we are repeating exactly the same pattern. The only difference is that our slaves for wine are more subtle, more disguised, more palatable to our modern consciousness. But the essence remains the same. There is always someone willing to transform human needs into profit, no matter the social cost. Rome left us much more than roads and aqueducts. It left us the perfect model for how to transform thirst into power, desire into domination, and need into control. A model that, unfortunately, still works perfectly today. And perhaps this is the most bitter lesson of all, that we are capable of repeating history's most terrible mistakes, as long as they are packaged in a sufficiently civilized manner. After all, who cares about a few slaves when there is so much good wine to drink?